Hi, this is Tom Salemi of Device Talks. Welcome to the Intuitive Talks podcast. Surgical robotics presents an enormous opportunity for companies. There are surgeon shortages, sporadic healthcare, and miraculous technological advancement in both robotics and communications. So to understand where this sector is headed, we invited senior executives from Intuitive to share their company's impressive story. Change is coming. Consider these upcoming episodes to be guideposts for the future to follow. Hi, everybody. This is Tom Salemi of Device Talks. Welcome back to the Intuitive Talks podcast. We're going to talk about Intuitive's penetration into the markets in Asia today. I had the chance to speak with Glenn Vavoso. He is Senior Vice President and General Manager of the Asia Pacific territories. And we covered a lot of ground, including his first job out of college, sort of. He was in the Navy and very interesting experience there. Then we'll talk about his move into medtech, and finally, how surgical robotics is fitting into Asia's many markets, into China, into Korea. Each has its own unique characteristic and its own unique take and use of surgical robotics. And Intuitive is doing extremely well there. So going to learn a lot from Glenn Vavoso today. But before we begin this episode, I wanted to tell you about Device Talks West, which is happening on October 18th and 19th, right near Intuitive's headquarters at the Santa Clara Convention Center. Very happy to have new president Dave Rosa as a keynote speaker. He'll be opening up day 2, October 19th. He'll be our opening keynote interview. Have had the chance to speak with Dave on the podcast, but that was before he assumed his new title. So very eager to catch up and to learn about what this means for Intuitive's future. So make sure you go to devicetalks.com. You can find the information, the agenda, the speakers for Device Talks West, and you can register there as well. Any Intuitive employees who would like to attend, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Be happy to tell you how to make that happen. So once again, Device Talks West, it's happening October 18th and 19th. At the Santa Clara Convention Center. Very happy to have Dave Rosa as a keynote interview, and we'll have some other great Intuitive speakers as well. All right. Without any further delay, let's begin my interview with Glenn Vavoso, again, Senior Vice President and General Manager of APAC at Intuitive. Well, Glenn Vavoso, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Tom. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. We normally start these conversations that we'll get into the whole Intuitive surgical and Da Vinci and Asia stuff later on. Let's get into the real reason I wanted to have you here. We'll talk about your path to medtech, but before that, I know prior to you joining the medical device companies, you were in the Navy. You served on a Los Angeles class sub, USS Albany. Did you ever do a crazy Ivan? That's what I got to know.
Didn't exactly do a crazy Ivan, but they have come close from time to time.
How was that experience? You were on a sub in the mid to late 80s, so I'm guessing you saw some things that you're not going to tell us about, but give us an overall recounting of that experience. So what was that like?
Well, at times it could be described as maybe 99% sheer boredom, followed by 1% of sheer terror. And you're always prepared for that 1%.
Yeah.
Spent a lot of time preparing for that, for sure. But yeah, it was interesting times back then. That was when the whole Berlin Wall was coming down, and the whole dynamic with the Soviet Union. So really interesting times, no doubt.
I'm sure you were being asked to pay attention. And what was your role on the sub? What was your duty?
Yeah, I was one of the officers on board. Had a variety of different roles. Assistant weapons officer. I was the damage control assistant engineering officer, assistant navigator at the time. Yeah, so variety. You kind of do rotations through different specialties within the crew. And
just finally, looking back, do you sort of just remember you've talked about the 99% boredom, 1% terror, but just in terms of the accommodations, do you look back and say, no, that wasn't so bad? Or do you look back and say, thank God I don't live in a metal tube under the ocean anymore?
Yeah, I did it for 7 years, and I look back. I think you always remember the good times.
Yeah.
you don't remember the sort of the pains and the struggles that you go through, and the living accommodations. If you really think back on it, you'll go, "Oh, that was kind of tough," but it wasn't bad. It was well accommodated, and it's sort of well known in the submarine force. They have the best food, so we always had really good meals. And once you were under the surface and underwater, you were good to go and didn't think too much about it.
That's very cool. All right, well, let's get into the business at hand. How did you move from serving our country to the medtech industry? What was that path like?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a winding road, but I had a colleague, a Navy colleague of mine, good buddy, and he was getting out of the Navy, and he was telling me what he was going to do when he got out, which was to help cardiologists with implantation of pacemakers and defibrillators. And I was like, "What do you know about heart and cardiologists and heart doctors?" He was a submarine officer himself as well. And so he went on his way and did his thing. And a couple months later, it was kind of my turn to get out. And I decided to go back to school and kind of retool with an MBA following my Navy career, and ended up getting into the aerospace business for a couple of years. But along the way, I was keeping in touch with that Navy colleague, and he went on to work for a company called Guidant. It was a cardiovascular company, and ended up, kind of long story short, coming over to that organization. And I started as a clinical support representative. So it was sort of supporting the sales team in implantation of pacemakers and defibrillators, and ended up moving into sales. And I was with Guidant for 10 years, right up until the Boston Scientific acquisition. And of course, right before that it was almost a J&J company, but that didn't quite work out that way.
Did you stay for long after the Boston Scientific acquisition? Was it your plan to stay? Were you invited to stay, or I'm not sure exactly how I remember the acquisition. I don't remember how things were handled in terms of who stayed and who left. This
was early 2006. And my intent at the time was I was going to be staying, but as things would go, I had a neighbor of mine. I was living in Florida at the time. A neighbor of mine who was also working for a medical device company, and we knew each other socially. He would tell me about this surgery company, and I would always talk about cardiology company. And he said, "Hey, you got to come and check out this robot thing." And I, for a couple of years, didn't really pay too much attention to it. And then it was right at the beginning of that 2006 timeframe, as we were going through the acquisition, first with J&J, then Boston Scientific. And I was at this point, I had moved to Indiana in the corporate office of Guidant.
Oh.
And, with that kind of chaos going on, I said, well, let me take a look at what this company was about. And that was Intuitive. Ended up getting a test drive on the technology. From there, sort of the rest is history. I ended up coming over in March of 2006.
Did it feel like a move to another medical device company to you, or did it feel more like the move from aerospace to the medtech industry? Was it not quite the same?
I would say for sure it was in healthcare, and so understood the dynamics. Having worked for Guidant for 10 years, it was going to be working with surgeons, physicians, and kind of changing their beliefs. That was very much the same. I will tell you, having been involved with Guidant for that period of time, and having the opportunity to sit on the Da Vinci and get a test drive, it becomes almost instantly recognizable that this is going to change surgery.
Really?
You get that immediate kind of visceral feel of how good this is and what it could mean. And so to me, that was compelling, and certainly a lot different than I think, pacemakers were at that time more of a commodity, if you will. And this was going to be a game changer.
Yeah, and I would suppose the pacemakers and the other things you were selling, you were probably relying more on data and on information to make the sale, and relationships as well. But when you've got a sort of a game-changing technology like a robot, you must really kind of light the fire inside of you to really kind of tell its story and tell it correctly to an interested customer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Very cool. So you moved your way up through the sales ranks. How did you come to begin working in the Asia territory, which you now oversee?
Yeah, I've been with Intuitive for the last 17 years, and almost for the last 10 years have spent time supporting our Asian markets. If you look at Asia as a region for us over that 10 years, it was a geography that was mostly managed through distributor relationships. It was, as we were developing as an organization, putting a lot of focus into our US, following our European operations. Asia at that time was managed with distributors who, in those early days, did a wonderful job of getting things going in Asia. But it was clear it was time for us to make some transitions in the major markets of Asia. And so I was involved in kind of sales operations team at that time. And in 2013, we were looking to take Japan from a distributor selling model to a direct selling model, where we were going to be now directly involved in the market as an organization. And so was asked to come over and start to assist with bringing on a new team, getting them trained up, sort of on our commercial operations processes, and really starting to develop our business model.
Is there a standard tripwire that sort of indicates now's the time we move from a distributor model to an in-company model? What is it? Is it the volume of business? Is it the intricacy of the technical assistance that's needed? What sort of makes that move more wise and prudent?
Well, I think there's a variety of factors that can come into play. Sometimes it's a moment in time for us where we can say we can kind of take on more. You probably have heard from others at Intuitive, we are always a very focused organization. We try to focus on the vital few. As you kind of bring up the maturity in other parts of the globe, we've made the choice, okay, now we can stretch ourselves and move into other markets and put the right time and attention into that. That's one factor that you assess. The other might be, for us at that time in Japan, it was the second largest medical device market in the world. You realize you have to be close to the customer and directly involved. And so it was a key strategic need for us to do that. In maybe some other markets, it might be you don't have a good succession plan for the current distributor that's in there, and they may want to move on to other things. And you realize that in order to be effective, then you've got to kind of take over that operation.
Interesting. So how are surgical robots seen in the various Asian countries? I've covered it from the US side. I remember when it first came out and it was seen by some as a novelty. They didn't think it was really necessary. Then the convincing became, and then the data became available. And now I think everyone's on board to this being the future. They saw what you saw when you first tried the system 17 years ago. What has the progression been like? We can start with Japan, but maybe I'm sure it's different from country to country, but what is the transition, but what is the adoption or attitude towards surgical robotics been like in Japan and other Asian countries?
Yeah, I could take maybe a specific, Korea is always a country from a medical perspective that is always looking to the future. I think always certainly pride themselves on their minimally invasive techniques and want to kind of push that. And so they saw robotics as an evolution of laparoscopic technique, and so kind of pushing the bounds on that technology. So I think in general looked upon it as very, very positively. Broadly, I would say throughout Asia, MIS or laparoscopy is more highly penetrated than many other parts of the globe. And so already a mindset that MIS is good for the patient. And of course, they're very discerning as to how they're going to go from that technique to a new technique and what is that going to mean for the patient. But they definitely look to push the curve on the technology. I think one dynamic that was also unique in Asia is maybe compared to the US. US adoption happened sort of very sequentially. It was urology, followed by gynecology, and then general surgery. And it evolved that way. In Asia, I think because of the perspective looking at what was going on in the US with robotics adoption, you now see the adoption across all those specialties almost in a simultaneous way. And so for us as an organization, we're always, again, trying to figure out how to best support our customers across multiple adoption curves within different specialties.
So when you started in serving Asia in the Asian market in 2017, was there one or two applications that were dominant and that you were sort of helping to bring into Asia?
It certainly started in urology, but then quickly moved into general surgery, and then gynecology also started to move forward. But initial applications were still prostatectomy, partial nephrectomies, but then there was a lot of interest in HPB surgery. In Japan, it quickly moved into gastrectomy, colon and rectal surgery. Some of that was driven by very positive reimbursement changes because the socialized healthcare system saw the value to the patient and to the economics of the healthcare system.
No, I was going to ask about that because we've obviously seen, particularly in China, cuts to reimbursement that are hitting other medical device companies harder. I think those with the more implantable kind of consumable products. Have those cuts and that cost consciousness, we'll say in China, has that impacted Intuitive at all? I know it's one of your biggest markets. How are you countering that, or do you have to counter that at all?
I think just like any other country, China's no different in that you've got to establish the clinical value first and foremost, and then for hospital executives and maybe even more so government officials and the officials that are over the healthcare system, what is the ultimately the economic value that robotics might provide? And so that is no different in China. I think maybe what other industries have experienced in China with changes in reimbursement policy or changes just in pricing and price controls, that has not yet sort of found its way to robotics in the same fashion. Mm-hmm. It's still, in many ways, early days of adoption in China. They want to see the robotic healthcare industry be supported in these early times. And so where you see those general price controls happen with where there are many competitors, it's more of commodities, and they're looking to control healthcare costs.
How did the Da Vinci systems physically fit into the spaces in hospitals in China? I don't know if they're built similarly to in the US. I don't know if the ORs are bigger or smaller. How do the surgical systems, again, fit into existing infrastructure? Is it easier than it's been in the US, more difficult?
I would say the same. If I blindfolded you, put you in an operating room in China or an operating room in Korea or Japan, took the blindfold off, you would think you're in any kind of operating room that exists in the US. Sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're the same size, large, that, varies, but, our system works just fine in just about any operating room in any of those countries.
Interesting. Well, staying in China, how are you? You've identified this as your second largest market behind the US. It's, I think, your fastest growing, and correct me on that if I'm wrong. What steps are you taking to cement that position and to encourage that growth?
China is the second largest procedure market for Da Vinci surgery. And, it's one of the fastest growing markets that we have. Asia overall, the uptake has been good. It's been well validated by surgeons and societies. In China, it is a market that is historically has been capped on how many systems can be imported and installed over a given period of time. So they have a very carefully planned allocation plan for large medical equipment, of which robotics fits into. And you have to go through a process of first making sure that the province gets a certain allocation of that. And then the hospitals then apply for that allocation, and they get the ability to move forward with their business plan to install a surgical robotic system. And so just like all the other geographies, we have a well-trained team that supports the hospitals, talks through the technology with surgeons. We do all of our customer training within China, across China. So very similar to other markets once you have the ability to install the Da Vinci system.
And what are you doing in terms of building manufacturing and other operations in China. I know you invested $100 million, I think, in a center in Shanghai. What are the plans in that regard?
We operate through a partnership there. It's a joint venture with Fosun Pharma. It's been a very good partner over the last 6-7 years. One that was part of that investment as we're then building out some of our infrastructure there, which will include some manufacturing capability, some moderate research and development, and then training capability in an innovation center for surgeons. That build out is underway in Shanghai.
Interesting. And how about on the Korea side? You mentioned Korea earlier on. Is there a particular type of system that is selling well in Korea? Is it the single port? Is the multi-port? Is there a particular focus for the products you're selling there?
Yes, we sell both the multi-port XI system and our single port SP system. In fact, Korea was the first country in the world to receive approval for the SP back in late 2018. And as I was saying earlier about Korean surgeons always looking to go beyond in making things more minimally invasive, for them, SP was very, very compelling. And so as they've adopted SP, we see our single port systems in Korea utilized to a level equivalent to our multi-port platform.
Interesting.
And already Korea is a country that the multi-port platform is some of the highest utilization in the world. So it was interesting to watch them adopt and apply SP in that environment. And I think for Korean surgeons, maybe even more so than multi-port, saw it as a big step from a multi-port laparoscopic procedure that, wow, I could go to one incision and provide all the benefits that I've been finding minimally invasive, but I now have one port to go through with an expectation and a hope to better patient outcomes, quicker recovery with that one port. And there's even a cosmesis benefit that they take a look at.
Do the XPs and the SPs, do they coexist? Will a hospital have one of each or multiple of each? Or is it sort of, this is an SP facility, that's a multi-port facility?
Yeah, they'll generally have an XI or multiple XIs. In Korea's case, we have many hospitals there that have multiple XI systems. It's a very concentrated market within Seoul. So they'll have usually many XIs and then an SP or 2 or 3 alongside those XIs.
And what is the competitive landscape like in Asia for surgical robotic systems? There's obviously a few U.S. multinationals that are trying to develop systems, a few in Europe that have developed systems. There's a few companies emerging from China that are developing their own systems. Have you had the field mostly to yourself up until this point? And do you see that changing over the next couple of years?
Well, in Asia, there are 11 active market-released competitive robotic systems.
Oh, okay. Shows you what I know.
So I would say it's a very active market for surgical robotics in that space. There are 5 in China, 2 in Japan, 1 or 2 in Korea, and a few others in India. So we experience a number of different players coming to market, and it's not just that they're developing it; they're actually on the market.
I know the penetration of surgical robotics in the U.S. remains fairly low, and surgical robotic systems to hospitals remains fairly low. What is it like in Asia? Is there a deeper penetration? Is it a larger percent of hospitals already own systems, or is it a similar, you're in single digits, teens right now, and you just see nothing but opportunity for growth going forward?
I would see it not much different than the U.S. I think there's probably there is more opportunity in front of us than there is behind us, even over the last 25 plus years. If you look at most of the top tier institutions in the 3 major markets of Korea, China, and Japan, I would say they are all highly penetrated with at least one Da Vinci system in there. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the top tier sort of institutions, but there are many more surgeries and many more patients that can be treated across the entire healthcare system. Generally, the penetration there is I would say, broadly similar to the US, but from a segmentation, very well penetrated in the academics and the higher tier institutions.
And how about the Ion and other? Is that selling there yet in your other systems? Do you see the same potential for those systems going forward?
We're excited about the prospects of what Ion will do for diagnosis of lung cancer in Asia, but not yet on the market.
And final question. I try not to ask COVID questions anymore, but this was obviously, I'm guessing the years 2020 to 2022, 23 were fairly challenging for you. How did it change how you were approaching the market, how you managed sales in Asia? And did it create some lasting changes that actually made your process more streamlined and more efficient?
Yeah, I think it changed a couple of different ways in which we operate today. In some ways, it gave us a greater reach because you couldn't meet face to face, and that we had to adapt to that. And creating events and opportunities to share the value story and just the technology, and even as we're getting to launch products and getting centers ready for that, we had to do a lot of that remotely. It was just earlier this year that China finally opened up. So it's been a long run of not being able to travel into those countries, or even for our own local teams to get out and about and get into the hospitals to support our customers. So we had to figure out how to do that very much in a remote way. And so it opened up, I think, in many ways, the engagement of surgeons to us as a company, us to the surgeons and hospital executives, maybe in environments where you wouldn't normally use that kind of remote technology. We're seeing that very much a part of our routine now. It's you can expand your reach in a kind of a one-to-many fashion versus just a one-to-one. And so now I think it's sort of that more hybrid kind of setup of having those conversations, supporting our customers. And they're very open to it now, where I think 4 years ago, that would have never crossed their mind that we can engage in this way. And even for us as a company, from a corporate perspective, that while we couldn't travel, we had the opportunity to interact with a lot of customers remotely. For me, my personal reach was probably improved just over those 3 years.
So you were engaging with the physicians as well as your partners there, or?
Directly with our team, directly with surgeons, directly with hospital executives.
Wow.
And, there was some nice aspects of that you could quickly set up those communication links without necessarily having to be on a plane all the time, and sort of maximizing the efficiency of that. And again, I think that's what's changed, is that we can do that in a hybrid way. Nothing beats face-to-face in this, but certainly having remote capability and be able to connect with video is a great addition.
Right. Well, I hope it means you're getting on a plane a little bit less once things start going again.
Yeah, well, it's actually picking up more right now.
I bet.
Now that Asia is open for business.
Awesome. Well, interesting stuff. Thank you for joining us on the podcast, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom.
All right, well, that is a wrap. Thanks again to Glenn Vavoso for joining us on the podcast. Once again, join us at Device Talks West. It's happening on October 18th and 19th. We'll hear from Dave Rosa and other great folks from Intuitive and other surgical robotic companies as well. It's going to be a great couple of days. It's paired with our Robo Business Meeting, which is another conference put on by our parent company, WTWH Media. So it'll be a wonderful and informative 2 days for anybody in the robotics business or in the medical device business. We'll be talking about much more than that at Device Talks West. So go to devicetalks.com for more information. Please make sure you subscribe to the Device Talks Podcast Network so you don't miss any future episodes of Intuitive Talks or our other great podcasts. You can find the Device Talks Podcast Network on any major podcast player. Finally, connect with me on LinkedIn. I am Tom, Salemi. If you want more information about Device Talks West, you can reach out to me there. If Intuitive employees would like to attend, reach out to me there. Would love to tell you more about the event and how you can register. Well, that'll do it. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of the Intuitive Talks podcast.